Hello, my name is Dr. Matt Taylor. I'm a researcher and doctor at the University of Colorado, and I have been interested in and studying Danon disease for the last 15 years. This year's Danon Day cannot be held in person because of the coronavirus global pandemic, and so we're going to do quite a bit of this virtually. And I've been asked to give a brief 10 or 15-minute overview of Danon disease that we're going to call Danon Disease 101. I'll acknowledge that even though we've been studying this for 15 or more years, there are still many more questions that we don't have answers to than that we do. So this will be an overview of some of the things that we already know and suspect about Danon disease. And I hope that you'll find this interesting and hopefully will participate in our Danon Day. Just going to move our video off to the side so I don't get in the way of things, and off we go. Just by way of disclaimer, there are a lot of companies I interact with and organizations. I've indicated here that Rocket Pharmaceutical is one of the ones that's relevant for today because they are deeply involved in Danon disease research, for which we're quite grateful. And they're providing some support to our research team here in the United States. The things I want to cover today are to tell you a little bit about what cardiomyopathies are. That's a term that you may hear if you have Danon disease or if a loved one has Danon disease. We're going to talk about some of the different types of cardiomyopathies and really what type does Danon disease look like. I want to talk a little bit about the genetic cause of Danon disease, as well as why Danon disease is a little bit different in males as well as females. And then we'll talk about what questions remain in the field, for which there are actually quite a few. So cardiomyopathies overall refer to diseases of the heart muscle. And this term cardio refers to the heart, myo refers to muscle, and pathy is really to disease. So these are heart muscle diseases, where there's something intrinsically wrong with the heart muscle itself. Many of these are genetic, and they run in families. Many of these are not Danon disease. There are lots of different types of cardiomyopathies. When you have disease of the heart muscle, several things can happen. Your heart rhythm can go from a normal rhythm to something that is not so normal and may cause symptoms or even a risk of death. When the heart muscle doesn't work well, the same as if your skeletal muscles didn't work very well, you can have problems with what's called heart failure, where your heart is not able to pump enough blood to keep up with the demands your body's placing on it. You might feel tired, fatigued, or short of breath. Those are just some of the symptoms of heart failure. And then many of these conditions, and unfortunately including Danon disease, do progress to a requirement for heart transplantation for many patients. In terms of different types of cardiomyopathy, they come in different versions or different flavors. I've got a normal heart over here on the left side of the screen. The pinker area is where the blood that has a lot of oxygen is contained, and that's actually the area of the heart that pumps blood to the rest of the body. On the other side of the heart, where the color is bluer, that's where blood that doesn't have much oxygen arrives back at the heart, and then it has to go to the lungs to pick up more oxygen before it can be pumped out to the rest of the body. In Danon disease, we talk about two different types, both the dilated, where the heart chambers, as you can see, are somewhat enlarged. And when the heart chambers enlarge, the pump function of the heart, the ability to squeeze blood out, doesn't work as well, and the heart can't generate quite as much force. And also a hypertrophic or thickened version, you can see here the wall of the heart is substantially thicker than it is in the normal heart over on the left. And these hearts that have thick muscles do okay pumping sometimes, but that thickness makes the heart stiffer, and that stiffness causes problems. And so some of the patients with Danon disease, particularly the boys and men, will have hypertrophic disease. Girls and women can have either of these occur and may actually have one that then ends up developing into the other as the disease progresses. So if you've heard these terms, this is a little bit of a picture of what things look like from a structural standpoint. You'd like things to be just right with the right size. As I mentioned, if the inside of the heart, the chambers are too big, there's some problems with pumping the blood out effectively. And if the wall is too thick, you have a stiff heart that just doesn't work as well as that heart on the left, which is just the right size and shape and dimensions. So what is Danon disease? Well, in boys and in men, it is often from a heart standpoint, mostly the hypertrophic disease where the heart is thickened. That is the main problem we see in most boys and certainly in young men. In girls and women, it's a slightly different story. The heart can be hypertrophied or it can be dilated. And in fact, in some cases, it progresses from one to the other as well. And then there's some other problems that are perhaps familiar to many of you with Danon disease. I mentioned the rhythm problems in the heart, muscle weakness, not just of the heart muscle, but of the muscles of the body, perhaps having lower energy or lower endurance. There's some learning difficulties, some eye problems. Some of you might even have been diagnosed before you had many symptoms just because of abnormal blood tests that sometimes suggest a liver problem. We actually think that overall most Danon patients may have a pretty normally functioning liver, at least in most cases, but sometimes a test of liver enzymes will be abnormal, and it's actually more a reflection of disease in the heart muscle and the muscles of the body than the liver. And then there are probably some other problems that we haven't learned about, and we're actually looking to you as families and the community to tell us more about these problems. Overall, we tend to see more of these problems in boys and men and fewer of these in girls and women, although certainly some girls and women can have symptoms of Danon disease that appear to be as severe as those we see in some of the boys and men. And unfortunately, it's progressive, and many of you already know this. Some of you have lost family members to Danon disease. Many of you have seen your loved ones progress through the condition, and it is a little bit different than many other forms of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, where the disease doesn't tend to progress, and many other cases of hypertrophic disease don't always end up in transplant, whereas for Danon disease, unfortunately, transplant is a fairly common endpoint. So it's genetic, and we should talk a little bit about the genetic disease and the cause of this, and perhaps a little bit about why this is different in males and females. So just a tiny bit of basic genetics. You may have learned this back in high school, or you may have learned this through watching many of the TV shows or forensic shows that talk about DNA. Our body is composed of thousands, millions, billions, really trillions actually of cells. And within each cell, we have an area called the nucleus that contains the DNA. And this DNA you inherited half roughly from your mother and half from your father. And that lives in the inside of the cells called the nucleus. And under the microscope, if we're careful, we can actually start to see the DNA in these structures called chromosomes. And then if we go even beyond the resolution of a microscope, we can look at DNA, perhaps using an electron microscope, for instance. On the right side of the slide here, if we use that same diagram to take our genetic material or DNA out of the nucleus and the chromosomes and to start looking at the DNA, we actually can use some various machines, so-called sequencers, to read the DNA, the same as you might read passages in a book or a magazine article, for instance. We can read the DNA, and we understand a lot about DNA now, and we know quite a bit about the genetic defect and the DNA problems for patients with Danon disease. The genetic cause, we sometimes use the term mutation, you may have heard that term, or the genetic mistake is in part of the DNA called a gene, and that gene is called the LAMP2 gene. And the LAMP2, it has a fairly long name, so we like to abbreviate it as LAMP2. And if you've looked at your genetic test results for you or your family member, it likely talks about a mutation or genetic change in the LAMP2 gene. This could have been inherited through a parent. Typically, this is coming a little bit more frequently through women, through the moms, than it is the dads. And that's just because many of the dads with Danon disease have so many health issues that they are probably not having very many children of their own in some cases. But you should also be aware that sometimes neither parent has the genetic mistake in the LAMP2 gene, and it's a brand new change that perhaps shows up in a child for the first time, and nobody else in the family has the condition. The inheritance is sex-linked, We sometimes use the term X-linked because that refers to it's on the X chromosome. You may recall from high school biology that females have two X chromosomes, whereas males have a single X chromosome and a single Y chromosome. And without going into the details of this, I've just written down here that if a mother has a Danon disease mutation, she'll pass that on to roughly half of her children, whether they're boys or girls. On the other hand, if a dad happens to be well enough to have children and he has a Danon disease mutation, the way this sex-linked inheritance works is that he will always pass that genetic mutation on to his daughters, who will get the Danon disease mutation, but it does not get passed on to his sons. And as I mentioned before, males on average are more severely affected, and that's partly due to this sex-linked inheritance, because we see that in other sex-linked diseases as well. What does the mutation do? And I'll show you a picture in just a moment to give you a diagram of this. Well, the general problem is that the mutations in the LAMP2 gene mean that the instructions in the LAMP2 gene are broken or don't work very well. Therefore, the cells, when they read the instructions in the LAMP2 gene to try to make a protein, conveniently named the LAMP2 protein, they can't make that protein properly. Perhaps they make none of it, perhaps they make a smaller amount. And so when the body makes no significant LAMP2 protein, that's what occurs in males. So most males with Danon disease have no LAMP2 protein. But in females, some females will have some LAMP2 protein. And that again explains a little bit why the males may be more severe, having no LAMP2 protein, whereas females have a lower amount and they are less severe on average. If we do this in a diagram form, I've got a chromosome over here on the left. This is roughly the location of that LAMP2 gene in the DNA of the chromosome. All this blue you're looking at is DNA. We're looking at just the area where the LAMP2 gene would be. And in a normal healthy person with a normal healthy LAMP2 gene, the body has the proper instructions to make a LAMP2 protein, and that happens. And this protein, which you cannot see really even under an electron microscope because it's so small, this protein has a three-dimensional shape. It has a set of functions that it performs, and it really helps those cells, particularly those muscle cells, stay healthy. And we're still learning an awful lot about what this protein does. So there's still many questions that we still have to answer for what the protein's functions are. On the other hand, if you have a mutation in the LAMP2 gene, that causes a problem in the instructions, you don't have them, or the instructions have a mistake, and that protein you need to make can't get made. And therefore, there's a lesser amount, or in those males, perhaps almost no amount of LAMP2 protein, and that causes the significant problems. So that's an overview. We skipped over a lot of the complexity. Here are just some questions that we're still starting to think about. Why does missing this LAMP2 protein cause disease? We have some ideas about this, but there's still a number of unanswered questions. Why are some patients affected more severely? We have some ideas why males tend to be more severe than females, but even within those groups, there are some males who have a milder version, and there's some males who are more severely affected. There's some females who also are mildly affected, and some are more severely affected. And trying to understand that is really important as we develop therapies. The progression of the disease is really not well understood. In the medical literature, there are not very many reports of how this disease progresses. In fact, we're really going to rely very much on the patient community to help us understand, what does a child with Danon disease look like at birth? What do they look like at age 2 years of age? What about age 10? What about age 15? What's the average age when they have symptoms? What's the average age they might need a transplant? These are all really critical questions as we think about developing therapies. And then, of course, and this is, I'm sure, is most important to many of you listening today, is how can we treat this condition? How can we cure this? And what other things do we need to learn along the way to make sure that those treatments and cures are successful and last a long time? So I want to close with some calls out to you listening here about how you perhaps can help. There's really very little known about this disease. This is a rare disease. There are at least 5,000 other rare diseases, and we're all competing for research dollars and research efforts and for researchers to pay attention to this disease and not the other 5,000, or at least to pay attention to us as equally as they do to others. And a lot of this requires that we understand the disease from patients. And so we really want you to be able to participate in research to advance science. And I have to, embarrassingly enough, pause for just a second. So in terms of moving the research forward, we really do need some help from the community as much as possible. And we encourage you to participate in the research to help us advance the science, to help us advance what we know. There are 4 current studies that are ongoing, at least that I can tell you about. One is a medical records review. This is really taking existing medical records from patients and reviewing them. This is sort of looking backwards in time about how did you get from health at birth to where you are now in terms of your Danon disease. And we're able to do this for patients who are living as well as for those patients who are deceased. And we have a process for obtaining those medical records, which is relatively smooth and easy to do. There's also an ongoing natural history study that's taking patients sort of today and seeing how they do for the next 2 or 3 years, sort of looking forward, if you will, about what's happening to people's Danon disease over the course of a short period of time. There's a gene therapy trial which has just started. It's in a small number of patients. And right now, it's really being offered to males only, really because we have just more information, unfortunately, about males and Danon disease, and unfortunately, much less about females. And so we need more information on females so we can start to think about trials for females as well. Then there's a Danon disease patient family questionnaire. And those of you that are already in our research programs will have been asked about this perhaps previously, or if not, around Danon disease this year, we'll be emailing you to encourage you to participate in this questionnaire. It asks you some questions that we have difficulty finding from the medical records, and takes about 20 minutes to complete because it's fairly comprehensive. So we'd really like you to consider that. All of this research involves some sort of informed consent. We can't do research without your permission. We also can't do research if you haven't contacted us in the first place. So we really encourage those of you to think about getting connected with one of our centers and engaging in the research. We can walk you through our consent process, and then we can have you participate. Everyone can really participate in that natural history study for the medical records. Everyone can do the questionnaire. And then the other ones are depending on whether or not you meet the eligibility criteria, of course. And those may change over time as well. Thank you very much for listening. And for those of you that have already shared and are joining the cause, for someone who's been following this field for, as I said, 15 plus years, it's really rewarding and exciting to see that exciting things are happening and we're making progress. And although some of this obviously falls at the feet of the researchers who've made this progress, really none of this happens without engagement from patients and families. And those of us that participate really started this line of research because we connected with one or more families and really have appreciated the contributions from everyone in the field. If you are not connected to us or have any questions for us, you can reach me at the information I provided here. I happen to have 2 emails these days. Either one works. The one on the left is the newer one, but if you have the older one, that's fine as well. Also, my colleague and friend in San Diego, Eric Adler, his email is listed there. Please reach out to at least one of us if you haven't already. We'd love to hear from you. We're happy to talk to your physicians and providers and answer as many questions as we can. With that, I will thank you for participating in this part of preparing for Danon Disease Day, and look forward to hopefully meeting some of you maybe in person someday when we're past this coronavirus pandemic. Thank you and be well out there. And thank you again for participating in our research.